In today's video, we delve deep into the stories behind every individual who has been executed in the United States during the year 2025. As of now, a total of 25 executions have taken place across the country, all of them involving male convicts. These executions were carried out using 3 different methods: the widely used lethal injection, the more recently introduced nitrogen hypoxia, and in one rare case, a firing squad. Each case reflects a tragic tale of crime, justice, and the finality of a system that continues to spark debate across the nation. Let's begin with Marion Bowman, executed in the state of South Carolina. The events leading to his conviction trace back to February 16, 2001. At the age of 20, Bowman found himself embroiled in a heated argument with 21-year-old Candy Louise Martin over a financial debt. That argument quickly spiraled out of control. In a remote wooded area, Bowman shot Martin multiple times. Not stopping there, he dragged her body into the trunk of a vehicle and set it ablaze in an isolated location, attempting to conceal the crime. Hours before committing the act, Bowman had allegedly warned Martin ominously, saying, "You'll be dead before nightfall." The case took a major turn when Bowman's own cousin, James Taiwan Gatson, came forward and testified against him. He claimed not only to have witnessed the murder, but also confirmed that Bowman had premeditated the act. Law enforcement later recovered the murder weapon from a river, and forensic testing, including both ballistic and DNA analysis, firmly tied it to the crime. As a result, Bowman was sentenced to death in 2002. Over the following decades, he continuously asserted his innocence, alleging that certain evidence had been concealed and that systemic racism may have influenced the outcome of his trial. Nevertheless, the legal appeals failed to overturn his sentence. On January 31, 2025, Bowman was executed by lethal injection in South Carolina. For his final meal, he requested a spread that included fried seafood, chicken wings and strips, onion rings, banana pudding, German chocolate cake, and cranberry pineapple juice. As the curtain of the execution chamber opened, he cast a quick glance at his attorney, then looked up at the ceiling, slowly closing his eyes. When invited to offer his final words, Bowman addressed both the audience and Candy's family, saying, "Death row inmates may be labeled as the worst, but we've all changed since that moment that cost us everything. I know Candy's family suffers, and rightfully so. They're angry. If my death brings them some relief, then I guess it will have served some purpose. I hope they find peace." Our next case involves Stephen Lee Nelson, who was executed in the state of Texas. The crime that led to his execution occurred on March 3, 2011, when Nelson, then 24 years old, entered the North Point Baptist Church in Arlington, Texas. His motive was robbery, but his actions went far beyond theft. At the time, only 2 individuals were present in the church: Reverend Clint Dobson, age 28, and the church's secretary, Judy Elliott, age 69. Nelson, who was already on parole for a previous assault conviction, launched a vicious attack. He beat and strangled Reverend Dobson with a computer cable and then suffocated him using a plastic bag. Judy Elliott, although she survived, sustained severe physical trauma, including facial fractures and a brain hemorrhage, and endured a long and painful recovery. After committing these brutal acts, Nelson stole Dobson's laptop, took Elliott's credit cards and vehicle, and used the stolen cards to purchase luxury items such as clothing and jewelry. He later sold the laptop for cash. His arrest came swiftly as investigators found fingerprints and blood evidence on his shoes, conclusively linking him to the crime scene. Though another suspect was initially detained, charges against that individual were eventually dropped. Nelson was convicted of capital murder, a charge that, under Texas law, carries the death penalty. On February 5, 2025, Nelson was executed via lethal injection at the Huntsville State Penitentiary. As per Texas procedure, no special last meal was granted. He was declared dead at 6:50 p.m. Central Standard Time. In his final moments, Nelson addressed his wife, Helen Noah Dubois, who watched from the witness room with her white service dog. Looking at her, he spoke with calmness and clarity. It is what it is. Enjoy life. As the injection began to take effect, he added, I'm not afraid. I'm at peace. Let's ride. Warden, his final words to his wife were heartfelt. Let me sleep. Then, with one last breath, he whispered, love. He gasped twice. His body trembled slightly, and then became still. It took 24 minutes for death to be officially declared. The next case is that of Demetrius Terrence Frazier, who was executed in Alabama. Please provide the full content of Frazier's case so I can complete this portion accurately and consistently in the same tone. The case of Demetrius Terrence Frazier, executed in Alabama, reveals a dark and violent past that spanned multiple states and victims. Frazier was responsible for the cold-blooded murder of 40-year-old Pauline Starks Brown in Birmingham, Alabama. After forcefully waking her, he demanded money, then sexually assaulted her at gunpoint. Despite Pauline pleading for her life, Frazier showed no mercy. He shot and killed her before stealing whatever cash she had. But his spree did not end there. Merely months later, on March 8, 1992, in Detroit, Michigan, Frazier targeted yet another victim, 14-year-old Crystal Kendrick. In a horrifying act, he abducted the teenager and held her captive in an abandoned house. When she tried to escape, Frazier shot her, ending her life. He was arrested shortly after in Michigan, where he confessed to both murders. His admission sealed his fate. In 1996, Frazier was formally convicted of Pauline Brown's murder and sentenced to death in the state of Alabama. Years later, as Alabama expanded its methods of execution, Frazier chose to be executed via nitrogen hypoxia, a procedure approved as an alternative to lethal injection. The night before his scheduled execution, Frazier was offered a final meal. He requested Taco Bell items, including burritos and a Mountain Dew soda. On the evening of his execution, the procedure was carried out as planned. At precisely 6:36 p.m., he was declared dead, becoming the fourth person to be executed in Alabama using this method. According to the office of Governor K. Ivey, when asked for any last words, Frazier offered a public apology, stating, first of all, I want to apologize to the friends and family of Pauline Brown. What happened to her should never have happened. I want to apologize. His voice faded soon after as the nitrogen began to take effect. The next execution involved James Dennis Ford, carried out in the state of Florida. His crime occurred in 1997 and shocked the local community with its brutality. Ford had invited a couple, Greg and Kimberly Mallory, to join him on a fishing trip. But instead of a peaceful outing, the event turned into a nightmare. Without warning, Ford attacked Greg, shooting him in the head with a .22 caliber rifle and then bludgeoning him with an axe. Kimberly, too, was brutally assaulted, struck in the head, and then sexually assaulted before being murdered. What makes the crime even more horrifying is what followed. The couple's 22-month-old daughter was left unattended in the truck for more than 18 hours, exposed to the elements and covered in her mother's blood. Ford was found guilty of multiple charges, including double murder, sexual assault, and child abuse. The savagery of the crime, combined with the helplessness of the toddler, led to a swift and harsh sentence despite filing multiple appeals. His conviction and death sentence were upheld in 1999. He remained on death row at Florida State Prison for over 2 decades. Florida's use of the death penalty in recent years has been inconsistent. In 2024, the state carried out only 1 execution, a sharp decline compared to 6 executions in 2023. However, Ford's case marked the end of a period of inactivity when Governor Ron DeSantis signed his death warrant. On the eve of his execution, Ford was allowed a last meal. He requested steak, macaroni and cheese, fried okra, sweet potatoes, pumpkin pie, and sweet tea. As he lay strapped to the gurney before 25 witnesses, he chose not to speak. The Department of Corrections later revealed that he had written a message on paper which read, "Hugs, prayers, love, God bless you all." Our final case in this segment is that of Richard Lee Tabler, executed in Texas. The series of murders he committed in November 2000 left a permanent scar on the small community of Killeen. Tabler first murdered nightclub manager Mohammed Ramunai and his friend Zed under the pretense of conducting a sound equipment sale. Together with his accomplice, Timothy Don Payne, Tabler lured the victims to a secluded location. Zed was shot first, followed by Ramunai, who was then dragged from the vehicle and shot again. After committing the double murder, Tabler stole Ramunai's wallet and other valuables, while Payne filmed the scene using a video camera. But the violence didn't end there. Just 2 days later, on November 28th, Tabler targeted Amanda Benfield and Tiffany Loren, 2 teenage employees at the same nightclub. Believing they had provided information to the police, he selected them from a list of staff and murdered them in cold blood. His behavior became increasingly erratic and brazen. In the days that followed, Tabler made repeated phone calls to law enforcement, mocking them and threatening further killings. He eventually turned himself in and was charged with multiple counts of capital murder. Despite his confessions, his trial was lengthy, with many legal complications along the way. He was ultimately convicted and sentenced to death. Tabler remained on death row for nearly 2 decades, becoming one of Texas's most infamous inmates. The state proceeded with his execution, carrying it out by lethal injection at Huntsville State Penitentiary. His final words and demeanor were not publicly disclosed, but officials confirmed the execution was completed without incident. Following his arrest and trial, Richard Lee Tabler was found guilty for brutal murders and for continuing to make threats even after the crimes had been committed. His actions, described by prosecutors as both calculated and remorseless, earned him a death sentence that remained in place for nearly 2 decades. On February 13, 2025, Tabler was executed in the state of Texas at the age of 46. The lethal injection, consisting of a fatal dose of pentobarbital, was administered, and he was officially declared dead at 6:38 p.m. He became the second person executed in Texas that year. In his final statement, Tabler expressed remorse for his crimes. Addressing the families of his victims, some of whom were present to witness the execution, he apologized sincerely, stating, "Not a day goes by that I don't regret my actions. I had no right to take your loved ones from you. I ask and pray, I hope and pray, that someday you might find it in your hearts to forgive me. I know none of my apologies can bring them back." He also took a moment to thank his family, legal team, and the death row staff for their support during his final years. His final words marked the close of a chapter haunted by violence, grief, and reflection. The final case in this segment involves a rare and highly controversial method of execution: the firing squad used on Brad Keith Sigmon, who had been on South Carolina's death row for over 23 years. Sigmon's crimes dated back to the early 2000s and involved a deeply disturbing act of domestic obsession and lethal violence. He had been in a relationship with Rebecca Barber for 3 years, and they had lived together. But in early 2001, Rebecca ended the relationship and moved back in with her parents, David and Gladys Lark. Refusing to accept the breakup, Sigmon began stalking her and persistently trying to force her to reconcile. On the night before his crimes, Sigmon confided in a friend, Eugene Straub, revealing his plan to break into the Lark home, tie up Rebecca's parents, and confront her. Straub refused to participate, but Sigmon carried out the plan alone. The following morning, Sigmon broke into the Lark residence and launched a vicious attack. Using a baseball bat, he struck both David and Gladys repeatedly in the head, killing them in their own home. He then stole David's firearm and waited for Rebecca to return. Upon her arrival, Sigmon threatened her at gunpoint and forced her into his car, planning to flee with her to North Carolina. However, during the drive, Rebecca bravely managed to leap from the moving vehicle. Though Sigmon fired at her as she escaped, she survived the ordeal and was later hospitalized. A statewide manhunt followed, leading to Sigmon's arrest 11 days later in Gatlinburg, Tennessee. He was quickly extradited to South Carolina to face charges including double murder, kidnapping, and assault with intent to kill. Sigmon's trial began on July 18, 2002, and the prosecution swiftly presented an overwhelming case. They introduced the baseball bat used in the murders and detailed the sequence of events through crime scene reconstructions. Detective Mike McNamara even timed how quickly Sigmon had moved between the two victims during the assault. At times, Sigmon behaved erratically, at one point displaying photos of Rebecca during trial without explanation, confusing the court. His former wife, Cheryl Tomberlin, testified about the domestic abuse she endured while married to Sigmon, further illustrating his history of violence. Family members of the victims, including Daryl Lark and Renee Smith, gave heartbreaking statements about the pain and trauma caused by the murders. When the jury returned with a guilty verdict and a recommendation for the death penalty, Sigmon's mother, Virginia Wooten, collapsed in tears. Meanwhile, Rebecca Barber sat in the courtroom silently, watching the man who had destroyed her family be taken away for the last time. After more than 2 decades of appeals and failed legal challenges, Sigmon's execution date was scheduled for March 7th. In a decision that drew national attention, he opted to be executed by firing squad rather than lethal injection. His attorneys claimed the choice stemmed from growing concerns over botched executions using pentobarbital. In recent cases, witnesses noted that inmates appeared to lose consciousness quickly, but were not declared dead until 20 minutes or more had passed, raising ethical and medical questions. South Carolina, anticipating the need for alternatives, had spent approximately $50,000 in 2022 to construct a firing squad chamber adjacent to the state's electric chair. The setup included bulletproof glass, a specialized chair, and rifle ports for trained marksmen. Brad Sigmon's choice of execution and the use of this rarely applied method rekindled debates over humane death practices, the death penalty's place in modern justice, and the emotional toll borne by families, survivors, and correctional staff alike. The reintroduction of the firing squad in South Carolina wasn't just a logistical decision, it was a response to a mounting crisis within the execution system. For years, the state, like many others, struggled to acquire the necessary drugs for lethal injections, even after passing legislation designed to protect the identities of pharmaceutical suppliers. As traditional execution methods became harder to carry out, South Carolina turned to a long-dormant alternative. In 2022, state officials approved and constructed a dedicated firing squad chamber at the state's execution facility. This specialized room included bulletproof glass for the viewing area, a chair equipped with a blood drainage system, and a partition wall to hide the identities of the shooters. While witnesses could see the inmate's profile, they were shielded from the sight of those pulling the trigger. The choice of this method was more than symbolic. It reflected a desperate workaround in the face of bureaucratic gridlock. No South Carolina governor had granted clemency since the reinstatement of the death penalty in 1976, and Brad Sigmon would be no exception. Sigmon's path to execution had been long and legally complex. Convicted for the brutal 2001 murders of David and Gladys Lark, the parents of his ex-girlfriend Rebecca Barber, Sigmon had stalked and killed them with a baseball bat before kidnapping Rebecca and attempting to flee with her across state lines. Though she managed to escape, the trauma she endured lasted a lifetime. After over 2 decades on death row, Sigmon's execution was scheduled for March 7, 2025, making him the first person in South Carolina and only the 4th in modern U.S. history to face the firing squad. As part of his final requests, Sigmon initially asked for 3 buckets of KFC original recipe chicken, hoping to share them with his fellow inmates. The request was denied. Instead, he was served a more standard meal, 4 pieces of fried chicken, green beans, mashed potatoes with gravy, biscuits, cheesecake, and sweet tea. A modest ending to a tragic life. On the evening of his execution, Sigmon was brought into the custom-built chamber. He was strapped into the execution chair, and a black hood was pulled over his head. Behind the wall, 3 prison staff volunteers stood with rifles loaded and aimed at a small target marked over his heart. At the warden's command, all 3 rifles fired simultaneously. Witnesses described the moment as chilling and deafening, with a sound that echoed sharply through the chamber. One observer noted there was only one visible impact wound, suggesting all 3 bullets hit the same spot with deadly precision. Sigmon was pronounced dead at 6:08 p.m., just moments after the shots were fired. In his final words, Sigmon quoted several Bible verses, arguing that the New Testament gives no authority for man to take another man's life. Through his attorney, he delivered a parting message: "Now we are under God's grace and mercy." His lawyer, Gerald Boking, later described the execution as horrifying and violent, adding that it was hard to believe such a bloody spectacle could happen in 2025. Sigmon's ex-girlfriend, Rebecca Armstrong, broke her silence for the first time in 24 years. She acknowledged that Sigmon had irreparably damaged her family, but said she did not believe the death penalty was the answer, stating, "Death should be in God's hands, not man's." Meanwhile, the state of Louisiana conducted another rare nitrogen hypoxia execution. On March 18, 2025, Jesse D. Hoffman Jr. was put to death for the 1996 murder of 28-year-old Mary Elliott, an advertising executive in New Orleans. At just 18 years old, Hoffman had kidnapped Elliott in downtown New Orleans, forced her to withdraw cash from an ATM, then drove her to a remote stretch in St. Tammany Parish, where he sexually assaulted and killed her. Arrested soon after, Hoffman was charged with first-degree murder. Following a high-profile trial, he was convicted and sentenced to death on September 11, 1998. Despite years of appeals, his sentence was upheld. On the day of his execution, Hoffman declined both a last meal and a final statement. At 6:12 p.m., he was brought into the execution chamber at the Louisiana State Penitentiary, and nitrogen gas was released into his mask for approximately 19 minutes. Witnesses noted that Hoffman showed convulsive movements before eventually becoming still, a disturbing visual that echoed the controversy from Kenneth Eugene Smith's nitrogen hypoxia execution in 2024. Hoffman was pronounced dead at 6:50 p.m., and debates continued over the method's humaneness. The state of Arizona carried out its own execution just one day later. On March 19, 2025, Aaron Brian Gunches was executed by lethal injection for the 2002 murder of Ted Price, his girlfriend's ex-husband. Gunches had gone to the couple's home in Mesa, Arizona, where he convinced Price to get into a vehicle, under the pretense of dropping him at a bus station. But instead, he drove Price to a deserted location along the Beeline Highway. There, Gunches shot him 4 times, leaving his body in the open desert. On January 15, 2003, an Arizona public safety officer stopped Gunches at a checkpoint. Gunches opened fire and fled, triggering a massive manhunt involving over 50 law enforcement officers. He was captured the next day, hiding in a barn near Wendell. In 2004, Gunches pled guilty and was sentenced to death in 2008. For years afterward, he became an unusual figure on death row, repeatedly requesting that his own execution be carried out, criticizing delays by the state. Although he was scheduled for execution in 2023, legal challenges delayed the date until March 2025. One day before his death, Gunches was served a final meal consisting of a double Western-style burger, spicy gyros, onion rings, and baklava. On the morning of March 19th, he was led into the execution chamber at Florence State Prison. At 10:33 a.m., he was pronounced dead by lethal injection, closing a long and violent chapter in Arizona's capital punishment history. Inside a quiet home, James approached 9-year-old Toni Nooner and carried out an unthinkably violent act that left the young girl unconscious. Instead of stopping, he proceeded to move her to a secluded area within the house, where he continued his brutal assault. The injuries Toni suffered were so severe that she did not survive. This tragic loss of a child marked only the beginning of James's horrific spree that day. After attacking Toni, he entered the bedroom of Betty Dick and launched another vicious assault, this time using both a heavy object and a knife to inflict catastrophic wounds. The chaos and noise of the attack soon alerted Betty's granddaughter, 9-year-old Wendy, who walked in on the horrifying scene. In an effort to maintain control and prevent any interference, James restrained the terrified child before he fled the residence. He left quickly, taking several of the family's belongings with him. He escaped in his vehicle. This shocking case quickly drew widespread attention and was later featured on the television program America's Most Wanted. The broadcast generated an outpouring of calls from viewers, who provided information and tips about James's possible whereabouts. Thanks to these leads, authorities were finally able to track him down. On October 6, 1993, he was apprehended at an unemployment office located in Bakersfield, California. Following his arrest, James eventually faced multiple charges in court. On April 5, 1995, he pleaded guilty to 2 counts of first-degree murder, as well as charges including aggravated child abuse and kidnapping. Several months later, on August 18th of that year, he was formally sentenced to death and transferred to Florida State Prison to await execution. Years passed before the sentence was carried out. On March 20, 2025, James's execution was scheduled to take place. That evening, just after 8 p.m., he received a lethal injection. There was an unexplained 2-hour delay between the scheduled time and the actual administration of the drugs. While strapped to the gurney, James declined to deliver any final statement. Witnesses observed him struggling to breathe before eventually falling still and being pronounced dead at 8:15 p.m. Though he did not speak in the final moments, he had previously shared words expressing an acceptance of his punishment. In his earlier statement, he acknowledged, "I don't want to die, but I believe this is the right punishment for what I did. From now until my execution, I'm just going to exist and try to accept as much as I can about my actions. I truly feel in my heart that I'm doing the right thing." Wendell Graham's story unfolded years earlier, but was no less disturbing. In November 2005, Graham was executed by lethal injection in Blaine County, Oklahoma, for a series of crimes that shocked the community. Before the murders, Graham and his accomplice spent time drinking whiskey and discussing plans to commit burglaries. Ultimately, they settled on a house chosen at random. When they forced their way inside, they encountered Drew Cobb, who was there with his 2 daughters and their friend, 23-year-old Amber Matthews. As Cobb attempted to negotiate to protect the children, Graham shot him in the head without warning. In a desperate attempt to flee with a baby in her arms, Amber Matthews was pursued by Graham, who shot her once in the back of the head and again in the forehead, killing her instantly. Graham and his partner then fled the crime scene in a stolen vehicle they found in the garage. Their flight did not last long. They were apprehended shortly afterward at a convenience store not far from their residence. During the trial, Graham was convicted on multiple counts, including first-degree murder and attempted murder. His accomplice received a sentence of life in prison with no possibility of parole, while Graham was sentenced to death. The loss of Amber Matthews, who died while trying to protect the children, added an especially tragic dimension to the case. Graham's execution date was scheduled for March 20, 2025, with a clemency hearing set to take place 1 day prior. When offered a final meal, Graham requested a supreme pizza with Canadian bacon, a half-liter of vanilla ice cream, and a Coca-Cola. Before the lethal injection was administered, he chose to make a final statement. He said, "I apologize to everyone for the harm I have caused. I deeply regret what I did, not only because it brought me here, but because I can't imagine the trauma, pain, and suffering I caused the victims and their families. It saddens me greatly to have planted so much hatred in your hearts, because I am not the person the state of Oklahoma has portrayed me to be." Another case involving Mikal Tanzi unfolded in April 2000 when he encountered Janet Esther in the parking lot of her workplace at the Miami Herald. Janet had been sitting inside her truck, peacefully reading a book when Tanzi approached and asked her for a cigarette. Without warning, he struck her in the face in a sudden, brutal attack. He kidnapped Janet and transported her to the Florida Keys, where he continued to assault and rape her repeatedly over an extended period. The ordeal ended in murder when Tanzi strangled her and left her body abandoned on a remote island. Investigators later recovered her remains and began building a case against him. Tanzi ultimately pleaded guilty to first-degree murder, kidnapping, and armed robbery. In 2003, a jury unanimously recommended the death penalty. Over the years, he filed multiple appeals and motions attempting to overturn his sentence, but each was denied. On April 16, 2025, Mikal Tanzi was executed by lethal injection, making him the third person executed in Florida that year. His last meal included fried pork, bacon, a baked potato, corn, ice cream, chocolate, and soda. When offered an opportunity to share any final words, Tanzi said, "I want to apologize to the family of Janet Esther and Carolyn Holder for taking their lives." He concluded by reciting a Bible verse, asking God to forgive those who did not understand the gravity of their actions. At 8 p.m., he was pronounced dead after 22 years spent on death row. Finally, the case of Mikal Deen Mahdi demonstrated the terror of a multi-state crime spree. In July 2004, over the course of 3 days, Mahdi committed a string of violent offenses that left several victims dead. The spree began when he murdered Greg Jones in Brunswick County, Virginia, after a drug deal escalated into violence. Just days later, Mahdi robbed a convenience store in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, shooting and killing the employee, Christopher Jason Boggs. He then fled to South Carolina, where he kidnapped a man, stole his vehicle, and continued his flight. Across state lines, his violence culminated when he arrived at a farm in Calhoun County, where he murdered 56-year-old off-duty police officer James Myers. Mahdi tried to destroy the evidence by dousing the body in diesel fuel and attempting to set it on fire. The manhunt ended when authorities captured him in Florida on July 21, 2004. While he was driving the murdered officer's stolen vehicle, Mahdi's execution was ultimately carried out by firing squad, a rare method in modern times, bringing an end to a spree that terrorized multiple communities. His crimes remain a sobering reminder of the destructive consequences of violence and desperation. After Mikal Deen Mahdi was captured driving the stolen truck of one of his victims, he was extradited to South Carolina to face justice. In 2006, he was sentenced to death for the murder of James Myers, an off-duty police officer whose life Mahdi had ended so violently. Years later, in 2011, he also received a life sentence in North Carolina for killing Christopher Jason Boggs, a convenience store clerk gunned down during a robbery. Although Mahdi openly confessed to the murder of Greg Jones in Virginia, he was never formally tried for that crime. While incarcerated, Mahdi remained dangerous. In 2009, he and another inmate attempted to murder a corrections officer, though their plan ultimately failed. Despite filing multiple appeals in an effort to overturn his sentence, Mahdi's death penalty remained in place. On April 11, 2025, Mikal Deen Mahdi was executed by firing squad at the Broad River Correctional Institution. He became only the second person put to death by this method in South Carolina and the fifth in the entire United States since 1976. At exactly 6:01 p.m., the firing squad discharged their weapons. Witnesses reported that Mahdi groaned and continued to breathe for about 80 seconds before falling silent. He was declared dead for minutes later. At 6:05 p.m., he declined the opportunity to share any final words with those present. For his last meal, he requested a medium-rare ribeye steak accompanied by mushroom risotto, broccoli, collard greens, cheesecake, and sweet tea. Among the witnesses was his attorney, David Weiss, who condemned the execution as a barbaric and inhumane act. Weiss described the firing squad as something that belonged in the darkest chapters of history rather than in a modern, civilized society. Mahdi spent 19 years on death row before the sentence was finally carried out. Moises Sandoval Mendoza, another individual whose crimes shocked the public, was executed by lethal injection on April 24, 2025. At the age of 41, Mendoza faced justice for the brutal murder of 20-year-old Rochelle O'Neal Tolson, a young mother whose life ended in March 2004. According to court records, Mendoza kidnapped Rochelle from her home, transported her to an isolated field, and subjected her to unimaginable violence. He sexually assaulted her, strangled her, and then stabbed her repeatedly. In an attempt to conceal the crime, he set her body on fire and abandoned it in a remote location. The following day, Tolson's 5-month-old baby was discovered alive, while Rochelle's remains were not located until 6 days later. During the investigation, Mendoza admitted to killing Rochelle but denied sexually assaulting her, insisting she had willingly accompanied him. Nonetheless, he led law enforcement to the site where he left her body and provided evidence that further confirmed his involvement. Prosecutors painted a picture of a man whose life had become a pattern of escalating violence, pointing to prior robberies and assaults. In contrast, the defense presented testimony from witnesses who spoke about Mendoza's severe depression during his late teenage years, arguing that his mental health struggles should be considered in sentencing. However, the Collin County Prosecutor's Office emphasized that Mendoza showed no genuine remorse and seemed to take a disturbing pride in what he had done. Before he was put to death, Mendoza chose to speak his final words. He admitted, "I regret stealing Rochelle's life," acknowledging that his actions had also stolen a mother from her daughter. He continued, "I'm sorry. I don't know if anything I say or do can make up for it. I want you to know that I'm sincere. I apologize." He then briefly addressed his wife, his sister, and to friends in Spanish, telling them he loved them, was at peace, and wanted them to know he was okay. Rochelle's daughter was not present for the execution. Mendoza was declared dead at 6:40 p.m. at the Huntsville State Penitentiary in Texas, having spent about 21 years awaiting execution. James Osgood's crimes also left an indelible mark on his community. In October 2010, 44-year-old Tracy Lynn Wildman was trying to rebuild her life in Clanton, Alabama, after going through a difficult divorce. One night, Osgood, together with his accomplice Tanya Van Dyke, invaded Tracy's home and attacked her. In her own bedroom, the pair subjected her to a horrific ordeal, sexually assaulting her and forcing her to comply with their demands. In the final moments of the attack, Osgood cut Tracy's throat multiple times and stabbed her repeatedly in the back, ending her life in a brutal, frenzied assault. Law enforcement quickly identified the two suspects and captured them soon after the crime. During the legal proceedings, Tanya Van Dyke was sentenced to life in prison without parole for her role in the crimes. James Osgood, whose actions had been especially violent and deliberate, was sentenced to death. While being held in Chilton County, Osgood provided a full confession to investigators, describing the events of that night in detail. He recounted how he and Van Dyke planned the break-in and how he escalated the violence to murder. Over the years, Osgood filed numerous appeals and motions to overturn his conviction and sentence. Each was denied. Eventually, the state of Alabama scheduled his execution by lethal injection, closing a case that had haunted the community for more than a decade. During the investigation into the brutal murder of Tracy Lynn Wildman, James Osgood gave a chilling statement to the Chilton County Sheriff's Department. He recounted that, as he attacked Tracy, he could see the fear and desperation in her eyes. Despite repeatedly stabbing and slashing her, Osgood claimed that he felt no anger toward her personally. Instead, he described experiencing only an overwhelming compulsion to end her life. He even asserted that in the midst of the violence, he apologized to Tracy and insisted it was nothing personal. The shocking lack of remorse and the calculated nature of the crime stunned both investigators and prosecutors alike. When the case went to trial, Senior Assistant District Attorney C.J. Robinson characterized the murder as the culmination of a twisted fantasy. Robinson emphasized that Osgood derived satisfaction from dominating and terrorizing the victim, and that the violence was deliberate and sadistic. Years later, in a resentencing hearing held in 2018, Osgood publicly declared that he believed firmly in the ancient principle of an eye for an eye. For that reason, he announced that he would not seek any further appeals and fully accepted that he deserved to die for what he had done. On the day he was scheduled to be executed, Osgood received visits from 11 people who came to see him. One last time, his final meal was simple. He requested pizza. In the final moments before the lethal injection began, he addressed Tracy's memory and offered a single statement, "I apologize." Witnesses later described that he wept as he spoke. At 6:35 p.m., James Osgood was pronounced dead. He became the second person executed in Alabama that year, and the 14th individual put to death across the United States in 2025. His execution brought an end to approximately 14 years he had spent on death row. Another case that deeply shocked Florida involved Jeffrey Glen Hutchinson. In 1998, when he was 35 years old, Hutchinson lived in Crestview, Florida, with his girlfriend, Renee Flirty, and her 3 young children. One evening, after a heated argument erupted between him and Renee, Hutchinson left the house in anger. He soon returned carrying a shotgun. Inside the home, he carried out a massacre, shooting and killing Renee and her 3 children, 9-year-old Jeffrey, 7-year-old Amanda, and 4-year-old Logan. After committing the murders, Hutchinson picked up the phone and called 911 himself. He calmly confessed, stating, "I just shot my family." When law enforcement arrived, they discovered him still at the scene. There was overwhelming evidence tying him directly to the crime. Gunshot residue covered his hands, and his clothing was soaked with blood. Hutchinson was arrested immediately and later brought to trial in 2001. Prosecutors presented a clear and convincing case, supported by forensic evidence and his own confession. In his defense, attorneys argued that Hutchinson had been diagnosed with bipolar disorder and suffered brain damage from his military service during the Gulf War. They also suggested that other individuals could have been involved. However, the jury rejected these arguments, finding him guilty on 4 counts of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to death for the murders of the children and received a life sentence for Renee's killing. In the years that followed, Hutchinson filed numerous appeals, arguing that his mental health issues and alleged irregularities during the trial warranted a new sentencing. Veteran advocacy groups and human rights organizations also petitioned the governor, urging clemency on the basis of Hutchinson's wartime trauma. However, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis ultimately signed the death warrant and denied all requests for clemency. On May 1, 2025, at the age of 62, Jeffrey Hutchinson was executed by lethal injection at Florida State Prison in Rayford. The procedure took about 15 minutes and proceeded without incident. For his final meal, he chose salmon, mahi asparagus, a baked potato, and iced tea. He declined to make any formal statement, but witnesses reported that he was heard softly whispering a prayer in his final moments. Glenn Edward Rogers, whose life was marked by escalating violence and deception, also became one of Florida's most notorious criminals. Born on July 15, 1962, in Ohio, Rogers was one of 7 siblings. He dropped out of school before he turned 16 and quickly entered into a turbulent marriage with his teenage girlfriend. Though they had 2 children together, the relationship was plagued by domestic abuse allegations and constant conflict. After the marriage fell apart, Rogers' life descended further into petty thefts, scams, and violent encounters in bars. Eventually, this pattern of criminal behavior evolved into something far deadlier. Rogers committed his first known murder on September 28, 1995. That evening, he met Sandra Gallagher, a mother of 3, at a bar in California. Witnesses saw the 2 leaving together. The following day, authorities discovered Sandra's burned body inside her pickup truck. She had been strangled before the vehicle was set on fire. Rogers fled the state immediately and resurfaced in Mississippi, where he met Linda Price at a county fair. Charismatic and manipulative, he quickly convinced Linda to let him stay with her. Just days later, Linda Price was found dead in her bathtub. Rogers' violence did not end there. He traveled to Florida, where he encountered Tina Marie Krebs. At another bar, after striking up a conversation, Tina offered to drive him to her motel room. 2 days later, motel staff entered Tina Marie Krebs' room after she failed to check out. Inside the bathroom, they discovered her lifeless body in the bathtub. She had been stabbed multiple times, including wounds to her chest and buttocks. After the killing, Glen Rogers fled the scene in Tina's car, continuing his path of violence across state lines. Just 4 days later, on November 9, 1995, he committed another murder. In Louisiana, he killed Andy Giles Sutton, who was found naked and stabbed to death, her body left on a waterbed that Rogers had deliberately punctured. By this point, it appeared he had completely lost control of any restraint he might have. Once possessed, the manhunt for Rogers stretched across multiple states. On November 13, 1995, law enforcement finally caught up with him in Kentucky. He was driving a stolen vehicle and led officers on a pursuit before they managed to arrest him. Following his capture, Rogers made a staggering claim. He boasted that he had killed more than 70 people. However, investigators were only able to confirm his involvement in 4 of these murders through solid evidence. Rogers also inserted himself into one of the most infamous criminal cases of the 20th century, claiming responsibility for the murder of Nicole Brown Simpson, the ex-wife of former football star O.J. Simpson. Although Rogers alleged that he had been involved, no credible evidence linked him to that crime scene, and his claims were widely dismissed by investigators. Nonetheless, O.J. Simpson's defense team mentioned Rogers as a potential alternate suspect during the high-profile trial. In 1997, Rogers faced trial in Florida, where he was sentenced to death for the murder of Tina Krebs 2 years later. California courts handed down another death sentence for the killing of Sandra Gallagher. While Rogers was ultimately convicted and sentenced in just 4 murders, he continued to hint at a far larger body count. His brother, Clay Rogers, gave a statement to CNN, declaring, "I'm absolutely certain my brother Glen killed Nicole Simpson and Ron Goldman. I know he did it because I've seen proof that he was there." Despite these sensational claims, no charges were ever filed against Glen Rogers related to the Simpson-Goldman murders. Earlier in 2025, Rogers submitted a request for a new hearing, hoping to present evidence that he had been subjected to years of sexual abuse during childhood. His legal team argued that this trauma should be taken into account as a mitigating factor and that his sentence ought to be reduced to life in prison. The request was denied. Rogers' attorneys also tried to stop the execution on medical grounds, claiming that he suffered from porphyria, a rare condition that could lead to excruciating pain during lethal injection, rendering the process cruel and inhumane. This appeal, too, was rejected. Florida does not permit inmates to select alternative execution methods, such as the gas chamber or a firing squad. After nearly 3 decades on death row and countless appeals, Glen Rogers' legal options ran out. On April 15, 2025, the governor of Florida signed his final death warrant. On the morning of his scheduled execution, Rogers woke up at 3:45 a.m. He chose pizza, chocolate, and soda as his last meal. That day, he was allowed a final visit from his wife. His brother Clay had come to see him the day before, traveling from Kentucky before returning home. On May 15, 2025, Rogers was led to the execution chamber at Union Correctional Institution in Florida. Shortly after 6:20 p.m., the drugs began flowing through the intravenous lines. Witnesses reported that Rogers appeared to struggle for approximately 10 minutes, during which his breathing was uneven and his body trembled slightly. It was not an immediate or peaceful death. He was officially pronounced dead at 6:30 p.m. When asked if he had any last words, Rogers offered one of the most bizarre final statements ever recorded. He began by saying, "I know there are a lot of questions that still need answers, I promise. You'll have them very soon, and I hope that somehow it helps you close this chapter." Then, with unsettling composure, He added, "President Trump, keep making America great." "I'm ready to begin." The room was filled with confusion and disbelief. Randy Robertson, the son of one of the victims, later remarked, "I wondered, where did that come from?" His wife, Amy Robertson, who was also present, said, "I thought, what the hell did he just say?" Even in his final moments, Glen Rogers managed to leave behind an atmosphere of bewilderment, ending a life defined by violence with a statement no one expected. In Indiana, another case unfolded that began with the theft of a white pickup truck. On the evening of September 29, 2000, in Beech Grove, Indiana, the vehicle was reported stolen from a gas station. Not long afterward, Officer Matthew Hickey was working the scene of an unrelated traffic accident when he spotted the stolen truck driving past him, carrying 3 men inside. He quickly ran the plates to confirm it was indeed the vehicle reported missing and radioed for backup. A pursuit began as 2 more officers, Robert Mercury and William Bill Toney, joined in the effort to intercept the suspects. But the truck would not get far. The pursuit ended suddenly when the stolen truck veered off the road and crashed into the front yard of a quiet suburban home. The doors flew open and 2 of the men bolted into the darkness. Officer Matthew Hickey quickly caught one of them, 19-year-old Michael Greer, while the second man, Benjamin Ritchie, just 20 years old, took off running through backyards. Officer William Bill Toney followed close behind, leaping fences and weaving around sheds and swing sets in the pursuit. As Officer Toney closed the distance, Benjamin reached into his clothes, pulled out a 9mm Glock pistol, and fired 5 rounds in rapid succession. Though Bill was wearing a bulletproof vest, one of the bullets struck just above the protective panel, piercing his chest. Despite the wound, he managed to fire his own weapon a single time before collapsing to the grass. His service pistol slipped from his grasp as he fell. Officer William Bill Toney died there in that backyard, one day before what would have been his 32nd birthday. He left behind a wife and 2 young daughters. Bill had only served as a police officer for 2 years, making his loss even more heartbreaking for the community. Later, investigators discovered that, for reasons no one could fully explain, Benjamin Ritchie had been wearing a wig during the incident, perhaps as part of a planned disguise or simply out of paranoia. After the shooting, he threw the wig and the gun into nearby bushes and disappeared into the night. Incredibly, he managed to slip through the perimeter officers had established and reached a friend's house, where he remained free for a short time longer. An enormous manhunt unfolded. Almost immediately, more than 100 officers, SWAT teams, deputies, and investigators flooded the area, determined not to leave until Benjamin was in custody. Roads were shut down and entire neighborhoods were locked down as the search continued through the night. Hours passed without results until an anonymous tip finally broke the case open. The caller directed officers to a nearby house. As dawn approached, law enforcement surrounded the residence. This time, Benjamin didn't attempt to flee or resist. He was taken into custody without a struggle. Inside the same house was Michael Moody, the third man who had been in the stolen truck. He, too, was arrested. The manhunt was over, but the legal battle was just beginning. As the case made its way to court, Benjamin Ritchie's life story came into sharper focus. Born on May 30, 1980, he entered the world already burdened by circumstances stacked against him. He never met his biological father, and his mother, Marion Bowman, struggled with severe addiction to drugs and alcohol even while pregnant with him. She worked as a stripper and moved frequently, never able to provide any stability. By the time Benjamin was only 3 years old, she had already abandoned him twice. When he started school, the trauma was evident. He was disruptive, unable to learn, and eventually dropped out in the 9th grade. At just 10 years old, Benjamin was admitted to a psychiatric hospital where he was diagnosed with bipolar disorder and other cognitive impairments caused by his chaotic upbringing. Despite these red flags, the system offered little help. In August 1998, shortly after turning 18, he was arrested for robbery and sent to prison. By 2000, he had been released, but he remained on probation and still lacked direction in his life. The chaos that marked his early years hadn't ended it, had merely been waiting for another opportunity to catch up with him. That opportunity came on September 29, 2000, after Benjamin was charged with murdering Officer Bill Toney. The prosecution wasted no time. Within weeks, Marion County announced they would pursue the death penalty. The case quickly became a flashpoint in the community. From jail, Benjamin gave interviews claiming that the shooting had been accidental, that the gun slipped in his hand, and that he had heard shots ring out while he was running. One of his friends also claimed Benjamin never meant to fire that. Everything had unfolded too fast. According to this account, Benjamin panicked because he was already on probation and knew another arrest could send him to prison for 8 more years. Whether or not the public believed this explanation, it couldn't undo the reality. A police officer had been killed. On August 10th, the jury delivered their verdict, guilty on all counts. He was convicted of murder, vehicle theft, unlicensed, gun possession, and resisting arrest. During sentencing, Benjamin's lawyers tried desperately to spare his life. They presented evidence that his mother had used drugs while pregnant, that he suffered from brain damage, and that he had never been given a real chance at stability. They painted the portrait of a child who had grown into a broken man, but the jury was unmoved. What sealed his fate was a detail that stunned even seasoned prosecutors. Tattooed on Benjamin's neck was the number 37, Officer Toney's badge number. It wasn't random, it was a permanent trophy, an ominous sign that he intended to flaunt for the rest of his life behind bars. On August 14th, after only 3 hours of deliberation, the jury returned with their decision. Benjamin Ritchie would be sentenced to death. He was transferred to Indiana's death row, where he would remain for nearly 23 years. But Benjamin's story didn't end there. Thousands of miles away, in Sweden, a woman named Ivana watched a documentary about death row inmates. For reasons she couldn't quite explain, something about Benjamin's case haunted her. She began writing to him, and those letters turned into regular conversations. Eventually, she flew across the world to meet him in person, though separated by thick glass. They fell in love. For years, Ivana made repeated trips to Indiana. The Department of Corrections allowed the visits, even for a condemned inmate. In case you're wondering, yes, Indiana's death row is unusual in at least one way. Inmates there are allowed to keep cats as companions to reduce isolation and improve behavior. Benjamin did, in fact, have a real cat in his cell. Over the years, he filed appeal after appeal, but none succeeded. Eventually, the date was set. In the final weeks before his execution, Benjamin asked the parole board for clemency. He said he was no longer the same man who had pulled the trigger in 2000, that he was sorry and still had something good left to offer the world. But no more chances remained. On May 20th, 2025, at the age of 44, Benjamin Donnie Ritchie was executed by lethal injection in Indiana. For his last meal, he chose the Olive Garden tour of Italy, a plate with chicken parmesan, lasagna, and fettuccine alfredo.